This is a really scary thought, right? That God is working out there in ways that I can't understand from here. And that God is sending me out there to be changed by the out there. I remember growing up, it's the story of this prophet named Jonah, who Jonah is sent by God to go to Nineveh, right? To tell the Ninevites that God actually wants to forgive them and vindicate them and liberate them. And Jonah's like, I don't want to, right? And so, but Jonah eventually does, and he goes on this boat on his way to Nineveh, and on the way there's these giant waves, and everyone in the boat is gonna die, and Jonah is thrown overboard, and this giant fish, this big whale, comes along and eats Jonah, and Jonah lives in the belly of this whale for 3 days, and then God eventually sends this whale to spit Jonah up on the shore, right? And I don't know how it was taught to you growing up, but the story was often like moralized for me. It was like, well, it's the stories about Jonah's obedience. Like, I don't know, like, I think, when I grew up in church, like, there's different tactics with kids that were allowed to be used. Like, obey God or get eaten by a whale. Okay. And then sometimes the story was like, oh, God was sending Jonah there because Jonah had something the Ninevites needed, right? So you should go where God sends you to go because there's people out there who need to have what you have or need to know what you know, right? That's actually not what the story is about. See, Nineveh was the heart of the Assyrian Empire. Nineveh and the Assyrians were really feared. They were known for their ruthless ways of trying to get the world to be civilized how they thought the world should be civilized. They were famous for their extreme cruelty, using all kinds of methods of torture and mass executions and exile to dominate their enemies, including Israel. See, it's very likely that Jonah knew people who had been tortured by the Assyrians. It's very likely that Jonah lost people who had been killed by Ninevites. And God comes along and says, I'm going to forgive them. And Jonah believed God and didn't want God to do it. They don't deserve to be vindicated. Do you know what they've done to us? Do you know how they've treated us? And so Jonah spends 3 days in the belly of the whale to actually reckon with his view of God. His view of God needed to change. His understanding of what the year of the Lord's favor is needed to shift. That the God who saved him from that storm would also save his worst enemies. The point of the story is that in order for Jonah to be sent, to go where God has sent him, it's not that the Ninevites needed to change. It's that Jonah needed to change. Jonah had to change and become and see the world differently. This is the story of our New Testament, right? God's people throughout the New Testament, post-resurrection, post-Pentecost, Spirit is moving, churches are popping up all over the place, and there's these two primary leaders. There's Peter, who's the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And then there's this Paul guy who was once a persecutor of Jesus, who was like a Hebrew of Hebrews, so well trained in the scriptures, who has been sent out to bring this message of Jesus out to the nations, out to the places outside of Jerusalem, goes all the way around, travels all throughout Asia, right? Now, back in Jerusalem, Peter had to reckon with this idea that Jerusalem was not going to be the Mecca of Christianity, that God was moving among Gentile people in ways that he couldn't even imagine or understand. A bit of a Jonah situation. Now, Paul had to reckon with, now I'm pretty well educated. I'm actually really well educated. And so I understand why God has picked me, right? I'm going to go out and I'm going to travel around to all these places where nobody has heard of Jesus, where God is not. And I'm going to tell them about God. And then we're going to throw these huge revivals, right? All these people are going to pray the sinner's prayer and come to the altar, and we're going to put it up on Facebook, and everyone's going to want to come and see. And the story of Paul's journey is that everywhere he goes, he realizes, oh, God's already here. God's already moving in these people. And actually, the things that the Spirit is doing in these places is different than what's being experienced in Jerusalem. So these two leaders in the early church who, as they go and do and be who God has sent them to go and be, they're realizing that God has sent them not to bring something, but to bear witness to something God is already doing, something that is beyond and outside their imagination. This concept is deep in the tradition. Some of you might know Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. This would have been a psalm that has been prayed by God's people for generation after generation after generation. Jesus would have prayed it. Elisha would have prayed it. Elijah would have prayed it. Jonah would have known this psalm. All these people throughout history. Psalm 23 says, even though I walk through the darkest valley, or you may have heard it said, even though I walk through the valley of death, I will fear no danger because you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they protect me. It's shepherding language, right? You set a table for me. Where though? Right in front of my enemies. I mean, even in the sacred prayer book of God's people has been this growing imagination that God is working in front of us among people in ways we could never understand or imagine. And that part of what it is to be led by God, to be sent by God, is to pull up to a table that God has prepared, where on the other side of that table sits who? Our enemies. Our enemies. That this Lenten journey invites us pretty soon to face death, to go through the valley of darkness, to sit in the belly of the whale, to spend 3 days with Jesus in the grave. And I want to say that the reason we walk through this every year, because part of the Christian journey is reckoning with our God view and the ways in which we resist God because who we might need God to be, or who we might need God to be for. The church I grew up in Eastern Canada, I'm from Eastern Canada, and my pastor there, Pastor B, we called him, was this old school kind of preacher. He had like this preachery voice. And every time he baptized people or someone was getting baptized, he would say in his like real preachery voice, he would say, buried in the likeness of his death and raised in the likeness of his resurrection. Buried in the likeness of his death and raised, and he'd lift his hand, raised in the likeness of his resurrection. And still today, all these years later, the church I was baptized in and watched lots of my friends and family and people get baptized in, I'm reminded of those words, that this is the journey, that we're buried in the likeness of his death, that we go through the valley of darkness. But there's a bigger story, right? That we're raised in the likeness of his resurrection. But often that valley of darkness is not this space that we just like grit our teeth through. But God is doing something with us in the belly of the whale that's changing the way we understand God and understand the world and understand where we have been sent. This is a really scary thought, right? That God is working out there in ways that I can't understand from here. That's just the first part. And that God is sending me out there to be changed by the out there. That I don't get my life together in here, and then when I've built up all of the right answers and all of the right responses and the best theology and all of my doctrinal T's are crossed and my I's are dotted, then I'm going to go over there and tell those people how they ought to live. That process can't be found in the book. But the story in the book, over and over and over again, is God sending people to places they prefer not to go, to be around people they prefer not to be with. Not because God is cruel and unusual, but because in order to do that, we need to go through a valley of death that helps make us more into who God has called and created us to be. And that when we arrive there, there's these beautiful epiphanies. I had no idea God could work in this way. I had no idea that God could redeem Ninevites. I had no idea that God could work in those people's lives through their culture. I thought the only way God does this is this way or that way. I'd never seen that. I never even imagined that God could work in that way. And God invites us on this journey.